What's wrong with my baby's name? After struggling with fertility issues for years, you're finally expecting your first child, and you're absolutely certain about what you want to call her. But when you share your chosen name with your husband over dinner, he just stares at you in complete shock. Please tell me you're not serious, he says, looking genuinely disturbed. I thought he was just teasing me about how long I'd been planning this, but his expression stayed completely grave. When he asked if I had any backup options, I told him absolutely not. This was the only name I'd ever envisioned for my daughter. He started rubbing his forehead like he had a massive headache and said, well, if you're completely set on this, but he looked physically sick saying those words. I asked him what could possibly be wrong with it, but he just shook his head and switched topics entirely. The next day, I shared the news with my mother during lunch, and she literally choked on her drink. She started coughing violently, and when she finally caught her breath, she asked if my husband and I were having relationship problems. I said everything was perfect, and she responded, then why would you inflict that on your child? When I pressed her to explain, she just kept shaking her head in disbelief and walked out of the restaurant without finishing her meal. My sister's reaction was even more dramatic when I told her during our weekly coffee meetup. She immediately grabbed her phone and started frantically typing, then showed me the screen asking if that's how I planned to spell it. When I confirmed the spelling, she gasped, oh no, you're actually being serious? And started crying real tears. She begged me to reconsider but refused to explain why, just saying our daughter would never forgive me for this choice. I spent countless hours online searching for anything problematic about the name, checking if it meant something offensive in other languages or had some hidden meaning I'd missed. I found was normal information about it being a traditional name with Welsh roots. Nothing explained why everyone was reacting like I'd chosen something absolutely horrible. At my baby shower, when my aunt asked about our name choice, the entire room fell silent the moment I announced it. My cousin actually gasped out loud, and my mother-in-law immediately left the room. My best friend Sarah pulled me aside and said, please tell me you're playing some kind of elaborate prank because this stopped being funny a long time ago. When I insisted I was completely serious, she said I needed therapy and left the party immediately. I posted on several parenting forums asking what was wrong with the name, and every single response assumed I was trolling for attention. The moderators deleted my posts and banned me from multiple forums for creating drama with obvious rage bait. One person even sent me a private message saying if I was being genuine, someone should report me. My coworkers discovered my choice when someone spotted my baby name list on my desk with only one name written on it. By lunchtime, everyone in the office was whispering and giving me strange looks. People stopped talking whenever I walked by, and I could tell someone had been crying in the bathroom. Nobody would sit near me in the break room anymore. My supervisor called me into his office that afternoon, saying multiple employees had filed complaints about feeling uncomfortable. He claimed my joke about the baby name was creating a hostile work environment, and if I didn't stop telling people I planned to use that name, he'd have to take disciplinary action. I tried explaining it wasn't a joke, but he cut me off saying, nobody believes you're actually going to name a baby that. I begged my husband to explain what was wrong, but he just said if I couldn't figure it out myself, maybe it was better I didn't know. When I went into labor, the admitting nurse asked for the baby's name for the paperwork, and her entire demeanor shifted when I told her. She excused herself and returned with two other nurses who all stared at me like I was completely insane. One of them asked if I was sure I'd heard the name correctly somewhere, suggesting maybe I was confused because of the contractions. After 16 hours of labor, my beautiful daughter was born, and the delivery nurse asked what name to put on the birth certificate. She visibly cringed when I told her, but wrote it down anyway with shaking hands. She handed me the certificate to review and sign, and I could feel everyone in the room watching me with this mixture of pity and horror. I stared at the paper where she'd carefully written the name I'd cherished my entire life. Had I just destroyed my daughter's future by naming her Gwen? The pen felt incredibly heavy as I looked down at the birth certificate again. The delivery nurse stood there waiting while two other nurses behind her kept exchanging glances. My hand started trembling so violently I had to set the pen down on the rolling table beside my bed. My husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair by the window, still refusing to make eye contact with me. I picked up the pen again and slowly signed my name on the mother's line. The nurse grabbed the clipboard immediately and practically sprinted out of the room with it. About 20 minutes later, the pediatrician knocked and entered for the newborn examination. She walked over to the bassinet and froze completely. When she saw the little card with my daughter's name written on it, her entire body went rigid for a moment before she pulled out her phone and started typing something urgently. She shoved the phone back in her pocket and picked up my baby to examine her, but kept shooting these bizarre looks at me throughout the process. She listened to her heart, checked her reflexes, and measured her head, but barely spoke two words to me. When she finished, she placed my daughter back in the bassinet and left without the usual new parent discussion about feeding, schedules, and warning signs. My husband finally got up and came over to hold our baby while I attempted to eat the hospital breakfast they'd brought. He sat in the chair next to my bed, cradling her carefully, but when I asked again what was wrong with the name Gwen, his voice cracked as he said we'd discuss it at home. The way he said those words made my stomach hurt worse than the recovery pain. Around noon, someone knocked and a woman in professional attire entered carrying a folder. She introduced herself as a hospital social worker conducting routine visits for new mothers. She asked how I was feeling, if I had support at home, then started asking about our name choice in this very deliberate way. She kept steering the conversation back to family decisions and whether we'd considered all our options for the baby's identity. The whole interaction felt extremely pointed, like she was trying to get me to admit something specific. My phone buzzed with a message request from someone I didn't recognize. The preview showed, please search your baby's full name plus your city before you leave the hospital. My hands went cold. I opened the message, but the account had already been deleted. My husband was changing the baby's diaper and didn't see me grab my phone to start searching. I typed in Gwen plus our last name and our city, but the hospital Wi-Fi blocked most of the results as sensitive content. The few links that loaded showed partial headlines about some local case from 3 years ago. One said, local woman convicted in, but the rest was behind a paywall. Another showed community mourns after, but I couldn't read more without subscribing. My mother showed up around 2 with a massive bouquet of flowers and a teddy bear. Her smile vanished the instant she saw the bassinet card still had Gwen written on it. She set the flowers down hard on the table and grabbed my hand, begging me to please reconsider before it was too late. She said she'd explain everything once we got somewhere private, but not here with all the staff around who might overhear. The way she kept glancing at the door made me even more anxious. She stayed for about an hour making small talk about the baby's weight and how the delivery went, but I could tell she was upset the entire time. After she left, the social worker returned with a stack of pamphlets about postpartum adjustment and something called identity considerations for newborns. She sat down and started explaining how name changes were incredibly easy in the first few weeks before the paperwork got filed with the state. She had this entire folder of resources about the legal process and kept emphasizing how simple it would be to make a change now versus later. She left her business card on my nightstand and said to call if I needed any support with difficult decisions. That evening, when the nurses changed shifts and we were finally alone, my husband broke down completely. He pulled his chair close to my bed and whispered that there was a woman with our daughter's exact full name who had done something terrible in our area. His company had employed her, and he'd been questioned by police as a potential witness, even though he barely knew her. He said he hadn't wanted to tell me during the pregnancy because he thought once the baby arrived, I'd naturally choose something else. The way he said something terrible made my chest feel tight. He wouldn't give me more details and just kept saying he was sorry for not telling me sooner. I held our baby and stared at her perfect little face, trying to understand how her name could be connected to something so awful that everyone reacted like this. The weight of not knowing the full story while seeing everyone's reactions was making it difficult to breathe. My beautiful daughter was only a day old, and already I could feel the shadow of whatever this other Gwen had done hanging over her. I needed to discover what had happened, but part of me was terrified to learn why everyone thought I was ruining my baby's life with the name I'd loved since I was 12. The door opened, and my mother-in-law walked in carrying a gift bag, but her expression hardened when she saw the bassinet card still had Gwen written on it. She dropped the bag on the chair and asked if we'd fixed the situation yet. When I shook my head, she grabbed my husband's arm and pulled him toward the door, saying they needed to talk privately right away. She practically dragged him into the hallway while I sat there holding the baby. Through the closed door, I could hear her angry voice getting louder and louder, though I couldn't make out the exact words. My husband returned 10 minutes later with his shoulders slumped and wouldn't look at me. The discharge nurse knocked and entered with a clipboard full of paperwork for us to sign. She went through each form explaining what they were for until she reached the birth certificate section, where she stopped and looked at both of us. Her hands fidgeted with the papers as she gently suggested we might want to review the name one more time before filing it with the state, since changes became much harder after that point. She kept the form on top of the stack and set the clipboard on my bedside table, saying we could take our time and she'd return in an hour. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister asking if I'd come to my senses yet about the name. The message had an attachment, and when I opened it, there was a screenshot of a news article from 3 years ago with a woman's photo at the top. The preview text showed our daughter's exact full name, but the rest of the article was behind a paywall, and I couldn't read what had happened. 2 days later, we were finally home, and the baby was sleeping peacefully in her crib when I remembered my sister's text. I got my laptop and logged into the library website with my card number to access their newspaper archives. After searching for 20 minutes, I finally found the complete article, and my hands started shaking as I read it. A woman with our daughter's exact name had been convicted of causing a drunk driving accident that killed 2 children from our area. The article had photos from the trial, showing her in court and details about how she'd been driving over 90 miles per hour when she ran a red light and hit another car. The prosecutor said she showed no remorse during the entire trial and even smiled when the victim's family members gave their statements. She received 15 years in prison, but the family said no amount of time would bring their children back. My husband's company name was mentioned as her employer, and it said several co-workers had been questioned as potential character witnesses, though most barely knew her. I clicked through to more articles and found the comment sections where hundreds of local people had posted their thoughts. They wrote about how they'd never forget that name and how it was burned into the community's memory forever. Some people said they'd torn down missing person posters when her family first reported the accident, thinking she was a victim. Others mentioned they still got angry just hearing the name and would never be able to separate it from what happened. A few commenters even admitted to harassing people on social media who had any connection to her. My husband walked into the room and saw what I was reading on my laptop screen. He sat down next to me and finally told me he'd been receiving hate mail at work ever since the trial happened. People found out he worked at the same company and started sending him angry messages. Even though he'd only met her twice at company events, he showed me screenshots on his phone of emails calling him terrible things just for being in the same building as her. He said he hadn't told me during pregnancy because he thought once the baby came, I'd naturally choose a different name and the whole thing would disappear. My mother called that evening, and when I told her I'd finally learned the truth, she started crying. She said she'd recognized the name immediately at lunch that day because one of the victims was her friend's grandson. The little boy was only 6 years old, and she'd been to his birthday party just a month before the accident. She didn't know how to tell me without ruining my pregnancy joy, so she kept hoping I'd somehow find out on my own or change my mind. She said every time she heard the name Gwen now, she pictured that little boy's face and couldn't help it. Later that night, I sat in the nursery holding my daughter while she slept in my arms, looking at her perfect little face. I realized keeping this name would mean she'd grow up with everyone connecting her to a child killer. Teachers would recognize it and treat her differently. Other parents would whisper at school events. Kids would Google her name someday and find all these articles. My dream name had become a nightmare that would follow her everywhere. The next morning, I called the Vital Records office to ask about changing the birth certificate. The woman on the phone said I had a narrow window to amend it without going through court proceedings, but I needed to act within the next 2 weeks or it would become much more complicated and expensive. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was changing the baby, and I saw it was my supervisor calling. He asked how I was doing with the new baby, then got quiet for a moment before saying HR needed to meet with me when I returned from maternity leave. He promised my job was safe but said they had to address what happened with my coworkers getting so upset about the name situation. I thanked him for calling and hung up feeling sick to my stomach because now even my workplace was permanently affected by this mess. That afternoon, Sarah showed up at my door with a huge gift basket full of baby clothes, diapers, and toys. She hugged me tight and said she was sorry for how she'd reacted at the baby shower and leaving early like that. She explained that her nephew went to the same school as one of the kids who died in that accident, and the whole community was still dealing with the trauma from it. She said hearing that name just brought everything flooding back, and she couldn't handle it in that moment. I told her I understood now that I knew the whole story, and we both cried a little while holding each other. After she left, I sat at my laptop searching for other names that sounded similar to Gwen or had the same meaning. I typed out lists of names like Gwyneth, Gwendolyn, and Guinevere, but each one felt wrong when I said them out loud. It was like betraying the daughter I'd been imagining since I was 12 years old, but I kept looking anyway because I had to find something. My husband came home from work and found me surrounded by baby name books and printouts from websites. He sat down next to me and suggested maybe we could keep Gwen as her middle name but never use it publicly. I thought about it for a minute, but then realized her full name would still show up on school records, at doctor's offices, and anywhere else official paperwork was needed. The idea of teachers seeing it on their class lists or other parents noticing it on forms made me feel nauseous. The next morning, the phone rang, and it was the pediatrician's office calling to schedule our 2-week checkup. The receptionist asked for the baby's name to put in their system, and she stumbled over saying Gwen when I told her. She asked me twice if she had the spelling right, and I could hear how uncomfortable she was even saying it out loud. I told her we were actually in the process of changing it, and she sounded so relieved. Later that week, I found a support group for new mothers that met at the community center on Wednesdays. I bundled bundled up the baby and drove over there, hoping to connect with other moms going through the normal struggles of having a newborn. When we went around the circle introducing ourselves, I just said, "This is my daughter," instead of using her name, and everyone seemed relieved that I didn't make them uncomfortable. One mom even smiled at me like she understood what I was going through. That evening, my cousin texted me a bunch of screenshots from social media where people in our neighborhood were gossiping about my choice to name the baby Gwen. She said she'd been defending me and telling people I didn't know about the accident, but they were all discussing whether I'd done it on purpose for attention. Some people were saying I must be a terrible person to choose that name, and others were wondering if I had mental health issues. Reading through all the comments made me feel like the whole community was against me. At 3 in the morning, I was sitting in the rocking chair feeding the baby when everything just hit me all at once. I started sobbing about losing the name I'd carried in my heart since I was 12 and how unfair it all was. My husband heard me crying and came in to wrap his arms around both of us while I cried into his shoulder. He kept promising we'd find something beautiful that wouldn't hurt her, and that the name didn't matter as much as our love for her. The next day, the social worker from the hospital called to follow up on how we were doing. She offered counseling services for what she called difficult postpartum decisions and kept emphasizing that changing a name doesn't change how much you love your daughter. She gave me the number for a therapist who specialized in helping new parents work through unexpected challenges. After I hung up, I went into the nursery and pulled out a fresh notebook. I started writing a long letter to my daughter about the name Gwen and what it had meant to me all those years. I wrote about how I'd chosen it when I was 12 after reading about a character in a book who was brave, smart, and kind. I explained how I'd imagined calling her name at the park, signing it on birthday cards, and cheering it at her graduation. I told her about finding out why everyone reacted so badly, and how I had to let go of the name to protect her from a lifetime of pain. I wrote that she was always wanted and loved, no matter what we called her. When I finished writing, I folded the letter carefully and sealed it in an envelope to give her when she was older, so she'd understand everything that happened. My mother showed up at the door the next afternoon carrying a thick baby name book with colorful tabs sticking out from dozens of pages. She'd marked every name that started with G and had similar sounds to Gwen, and we sat at the kitchen table, going through each one while the baby slept in her bassinet next to us. Her eyes got teary when she saw me writing down possibilities on a notepad and trying them out loud to see how they felt. She kept squeezing my hand and finally said she should have told me the truth from the beginning instead of hoping I'd figure it out myself. My husband came home from work looking exhausted and sat down heavily at the table before telling me his coworkers had been asking all week if we'd really gone through with naming the baby Gwen. His manager had sent out a department email about maintaining professional communication after someone made a joke about child killers in the break room that made another employee cry. He showed me the email on his phone, and I could see it was carefully worded to avoid mentioning our situation directly, but everyone would know what it was about. That night, I stayed up searching deeper into the case and found an old social media profile for the convicted woman that listed her hometown as just 2 streets over from where we live now. Her parents still lived in the neighborhood according to property records, which explained why everyone's reaction was so intense. They probably worried we were related to her or trying to make some kind of sick statement. The next day, I went back to the library to print more articles, and the librarian who'd been helping me access the archives asked if I needed to talk to someone about what I was going through. She mentioned her daughter had been in the same grade as one of the victims and pulled me into a hug when I started crying right there between the stacks. At my 6-week checkup, the doctor kept glancing at my chart while asking how I was handling everything with the baby and if I needed any extra support. She wrote me a referral for a therapist who specialized in postpartum issues and identity challenges, saying it might help to talk to someone neutral about the whole situation. I spent the next 3 days going through name websites and baby books until I finally found Gwyneth, which felt close enough to keep some connection to my original choice, but different enough that nobody would make the association. My husband's whole body relaxed when I told him, and he immediately agreed it was perfect, pulling me into his arms and saying we could finally move forward. We drove to the Vital Records office that Friday, where a clerk helped us fill out the amendment paperwork. Though she didn't ask any questions, she gave me an encouraging smile when she saw we were changing from Gwen to Gwyneth. I sent a group text to my family with just the word Gwyneth, and within minutes my phone was flooded with heart emojis and relief messages from everyone. My sister texted separately that she could finally post photos of the baby on social media without worrying about people recognizing the name and causing problems. The HR meeting I'd been dreading turned out better than expected. They apologized for the threatening tone of the earlier conversation, but explained that 3 employees had actual panic attacks when they heard we'd chosen that name. We worked out an understanding that I wouldn't discuss the original name at work, and they'd make sure everyone treated me normally when I returned from maternity leave. My mother-in-law came by that weekend with a soft pink blanket she'd had embroidered with Gwyneth in beautiful script letters. Even though it stung seeing physical proof that Gwen was really gone, I appreciated her trying to show support for the change. The therapist's office had plain white walls and a brown couch that squeaked when I sat down for my first appointment 2 weeks later. She asked me to start from the beginning, so I told her everything about loving the name since I was 12 and how nobody would explain what was wrong. When I got to the part about finally finding out about the drunk driver who killed those kids, her face stayed calm, but she wrote something in her notebook. She asked how I felt about my husband not telling me, and I surprised myself by saying I was mad at him. Really mad, actually, because he could have saved us all this pain by just explaining from the start instead of letting me look crazy to everyone. The therapist nodded and said it was normal to feel angry when someone withholds important information, even if they think they're protecting us. My husband started seeing his own therapist the next week after I told him how upset I was that he'd kept quiet. He came home from his first session looking tired, but said the therapist helped him see he has a pattern of avoiding hard conversations that goes way back. His therapist gave him homework to practice having one difficult conversation each week, starting with telling his mom about a work problem he'd been hiding. The new mom's support group met every Thursday at the community center, and I finally worked up the nerve to share our story at my 4th meeting. The other women listened without judgment, and one mom said she'd had to change her son's name after finding out it was the same as her husband's affair partner from years ago. Another woman changed her daughter's middle name when she learned it belonged to a relative who'd abused her as a child. They all understood having to let go of something you thought was perfect, and it helped to know I wasn't alone in this. The mail carrier delivered a thick envelope 3 weeks after we filed the paperwork, and inside was the new birth certificate with Gwyneth officially printed as her legal name. I put it in the baby book along with the sealed letter I'd written about why we originally chose Gwen and had to change it. The book would tell her whole story someday when she was old enough to understand. My first day back at work was awkward until word spread about the name change, and then people started warming up again. A coworker whose daughter went to the same school as the victims pulled me aside at lunch to thank me for understanding why the name was so painful for everyone. She said she'd been having nightmares about those kids since the accident, and hearing we'd chosen that name brought it all all back. More people started sitting with me at lunch again, and the whispers stopped completely after a few days. Sarah texted, asking if we could meet for coffee, and when I showed up with the baby, she was already there with her own daughter sleeping in a carrier. She said she was sorry for walking out of my shower instead of calmly explaining what was wrong with the name. I told her I understood why she'd reacted that way, and we spent the next hour catching up like nothing had happened. The barista kept smiling at us as our babies slept through the whole conversation. By the time Gwyneth turned 3 months old, I could finally say her name without my voice catching or feeling like I was betraying my original choice. She'd started smiling whenever she heard her name, and those little grins made something inside me heal bit by bit. Her eyes would light up and she'd kick her legs with excitement when I'd sing her name during diaper changes. We decided to have a small party to officially celebrate Gwyneth with just our closest family, since the baby shower had been so tense. Everyone showed up looking relaxed and happy in a way they couldn't before, and the house filled with actual laughter for the first time in months. My dad held her up and made a toast to Gwyneth, while everyone raised their glasses of champagne or juice. My mom pulled me into the kitchen while everyone was eating cake and told me she'd been telling all her friends how proud she was that I put my daughter's well-being first. She said it proved I was already a wonderful mother, and I started crying happy tears right there by the sink. She held me while I sobbed and kept saying she was sorry for not explaining sooner, but she was so proud of how I'd handled everything. My husband came home from work the next week looking lighter than he had in months, and said the harassment at his job had completely stopped. His coworkers found out about the name change through office gossip, and several people apologized for making him uncomfortable about something that wasn't his fault. One guy even admitted he'd been avoiding my husband because the name reminded him of his nephew who was in the same class as one of the victims. The whole office atmosphere changed once they knew we'd made the change, and my husband could finally eat lunch in the break room without people staring or whispering. That same week, I found an online forum called Name Changers Anonymous while scrolling through parenting sites during a late-night feeding. The group had over 3,000 members, and the pinned post at the top explained it was for parents who'd changed their baby's name for any reason. I typed out my whole story in the introduction thread, and within an hour had 23 responses from parents who'd been through similar situations. One mom had named her son after a beloved uncle, only to discover the uncle had been arrested for fraud 2 weeks after the birth certificate was filed. Another, dad picked a name that turned out to be shared with a local serial killer from the 1980s that everyone in his town still remembered. A woman from Canada wrote that she'd chosen a beautiful name that meant something horrible in the local indigenous language and only found out when a coworker pulled her aside. Reading their stories made my chest feel less tight for the first time in weeks. These people understood the specific pain of letting go of a name you'd loved and the guilt of feeling like you'd failed your baby somehow. The moderator sent me a private message with links to articles about name changes and statistics, showing it happened more often than people realized. At my next therapy appointment, I brought up what I'd learned from the group, and my therapist nodded while taking notes. She asked me to describe what I loved about the name Gwen, and I talked for 20 minutes about how it felt strong but feminine, and how I'd imagined calling it across playgrounds. Then she asked me to describe my actual daughter without using any name at all, and I found myself talking about her tiny fingers and the way she scrunched her nose when she yawned. The therapist pointed out that everything I loved about my baby existed completely separate from any name, and that Gwyneth was becoming her own person already. She said the attachment I'd felt to Gwen was really attachment to the idea of having a daughter, and now that love had transferred to the actual baby in my arms, I left that session feeling lighter and stopped at the store on the way home to buy a onesie that said Gwyneth in pink letters. 6 months passed, and I ran into an old coworker at the grocery store who asked about the baby. When she asked the name, I said Gwyneth without any hesitation or need to explain the whole story. The coworker said it was beautiful and moved on to asking about sleep schedules and feeding, all the normal new parent stuff. I realized later that night that I'd gotten through the whole conversation without feeling defensive or ashamed. About the name situation, my husband noticed the change too and mentioned over dinner that I seemed more relaxed. Lately, when people asked about the baby, we'd been going to couples counseling since Gwyneth was 2 months old to work through the communication problems that the name crisis had revealed. The therapist helped us develop a system where we checked in every Sunday night about anything bothering us, so nothing could build up like the name secret had. My husband admitted he still felt guilty about not telling me sooner but understood why he'd been paralyzed by not wanting to ruin my pregnancy. Joy. We practiced having difficult conversations about smaller things first, like household chores and money, until we got better at being honest without being hurtful. Our relationship felt stronger than before the whole mess started because we'd learned to actually talk instead of avoiding hard topics. My sister called one afternoon while I was feeding Gwyneth to share that she was 12 weeks pregnant with her first baby. She laughed and said she'd already sent her list of potential names to our parents and my husband's family for approval. We both knew she was half joking, but there was real wisdom in getting input before getting attached to something that might cause problems. She asked if I had any name suggestions, and I gave her a few that I'd considered when looking for alternatives to Gwen. Later that week, I decided to write about our experience on my personal blog that usually only family and close friends read. I spent 3 hours typing up the whole story from the first reactions through the name change and what I'd learned about community trauma and the power of names. Before publishing, I asked my husband to read it, and he suggested a few edits to protect people's privacy, but said I should share it if I wanted to. Within 2 days, the post had been shared over 1,000 times, and my inbox filled with messages from parents who'd been through similar experiences. One woman in Texas had named her daughter after a teacher who'd inspired her, only to learn the teacher had been fired for inappropriate conduct the year after she graduated. A couple in Maine chose a name that turned out to be identical to a local politician who'd embezzled from the school district. Parents shared stories about changing names due to family conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, and associations they couldn't have predicted. The blog post ended up on a few parenting websites, and I got interview requests from 2 podcasts about baby naming. I turned them down because I wasn't ready to be that public about something so personal, but it felt good knowing our story helped other people feel less alone. Gwyneth turned 9 months old on a Tuesday and hit every single developmental milestone right on schedule. She could sit up on her own, had started crawling everywhere, and babbled constantly in her own little language. Strangers at the park would stop to comment on what a happy baby she was and ask her name. When I'd tell them Gwyneth, they'd say how pretty it was, and I could honestly thank them without any complicated feelings. At her 9-month checkup, the pediatrician commented on how well she was thriving, and I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with what we called her. The nurse who'd been there for every appointment since birth mentioned she was glad we'd found a name that worked for everyone. I knew she remembered the tension from those early visits, when I could barely say Gwen without crying. Now I could chat easily about Gwyneth's eating habits and sleep patterns like any other mom. That weekend we took her to the park, and I watched her playing in the sand sandbox with another baby while their dad and I made small talk. She grabbed fistfuls of sand and laughed when it ran through her fingers. And I realized the whole name drama felt like something that happened years ago instead of just months. She looked up at me with those big eyes that were turning from baby blue to what would probably be brown like my husband's and squealed with delight when I smiled at her. This was Gwyneth, my daughter. Perfect exactly as she was, and I couldn't imagine calling her anything else now. Thanks for sticking around and wondering through all this with me today. Kind of makes you look at things a little differently, right? I'll see you in the next one.